people living in their communities.
The question is that this bill be now read a second time, and I call the member for Lindsay.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. It's always good to follow the hard-working member for Herbert, my friend Cathy O'Toole, who is always standing up on behalf of her constituents and indeed all the people right around this country who will be adversely affected by this bill, which seeks to extend the cashless debit card trial to regions in Bundaberg and in Hervey Bay, forcing anybody under 36 to become a trial participant. We oppose this bill. Labor knows that the majority of income support recipients are more than capable of managing their own income. This morning, Deputy Speaker, I was over in the Federation Chamber and I was listening to the member for Dunkley, a member on the opposite side of the House, talk about how he received income support when he was a university student. Now, it's a great shame that the member for Dunkley isn't here, because I would be able to ask him how would he feel if, as a recipient of a welfare payment, he was told how and when and on what he was able to spend his own money on. Communities are not homogenous, Deputy Speaker. They are inherently unique with their own customs and circumstances, and it is an absolute disgrace that this government is willing to paint all of the regional communities where they want to roll this out with one swift brush. The government refuses to acknowledge the importance of community by consulting by community on community level, and allow that community to have some decision-making, as well as the need to support community-driven initiatives. But again, is it really a surprise that this government, the government of the rich and plenty, wishes to take a top-down approach to the cashless debit card? I think not. The current limitations placed on the cashless welfare card trials are crucial to ensuring that this government does not overstep its bounds with rural and regional communities. And as we've heard from the member for Herbert, there are some significant factors in the breaches of a person's human rights when it comes to these trials and the cashless debit card itself. Extending the trial to potentially include around 6,700 more people in Bundaberg and Hervey Bay without the appropriate consultations is blatantly irresponsible, thus bringing the number of participants to over 15,000. Key groups from the Bundaberg region have been ignored, Deputy Speaker. Ignoring the wishes of the Bundaberg community presented to the Senate inquiry is blatantly irresponsible, it's arrogant and it is out of touch, all the key themes of this government. It is clearer than crystal that this Turnbull government has mismanaged and bungled this entire process, and it is the people of the Bundaberg and Hervey Bay regions that will pay the price. Unlike in the East Kimberley and Ceduna trials, the lack of consultation in the Goldfields and Hervey Bay areas is symptomatic of this government that doesn't listen, don't communicate and doesn't implement their promises. This lack of action in the East Kimberley is in stark contrast to the hope that the trial of the card was thought to deliver. Mothers hoping that their families would see support programs and training to help break the cycle, the treacherous cycle that is disadvantage, did never materialise. Labor will only consider supporting the introduction of a new trial site if this Liberal government can do its job properly and consult the communities they are planning on affecting. This government needs to show they are willing to listen to communities and establish an agreed definition of consent. The trial of the cashless debit card has been viewed through a prism of suspicion and mistrust. It takes a great leap of faith for communities to commit to this implementation, and the government ought to respect that. That's why we've consulted closely on this side of the House with people in Ceduna and East Kimberley, listening to their views widely, discreetly and with humility and with compassion. We support genuine, intuitive, progressive policies that acknowledge the problems and opportunities that are unique to remote and discrete communities. We are talking about people who have suffered greatly already at the hands of government, their representatives and others. Yet the original problem of systemic inequality, domestic and other violence remains, for the very reason we were told these trials were needed. This is hardly encouraging for potential participants in Hervey Bay and Goldfield areas targeted by this legislation. This government has paid $1.6 million to Orima Research to provide a weak and poor evaluation into the effectiveness of the existing trials in Ceduna and the East Kimberley. The results were inconclusive at best and torn apart by leading academics like Janet Hunt, who stated that people interviewed for the evaluation may have told interviewers that they drank less than before the trial began, but that such recall over a year is not likely to be reliable. Importantly, her paper also notes the fact that participants were required to identify themselves prior to participation. This raises serious questions about how they would respond and, in some cases, understand the questions and implications of their answers. It would be surprising if someone with a drug problem who has been identified by the interviewer would suddenly open up and discuss their volume of usage. Only 17% of the trial participants reported that they felt their children's lives were better as a result of the trial. The Orima research is not something the government should be basing its policy decision-making on. It is at best a poor quality assessment and at worst a demonstration of this government's negligence. These problems vary from community to community, country to country, state to state. There is no one-size-fits-all answer. We need to develop the levers that provide access to support when and where it is suitable, programs that address alcohol and drug-related problems, as well as policies that seek to address the systemic inequality that has placed these communities in the vulnerable positions they find themselves in. These communities do not need empty promises or rhetoric and half-baked attempts that are more likely to hinder and not help them. They need to be heard, consulted with. We need to listen to communities to find out what assistance they require and in their voices, and tailor programs to suit specific locations. One size does not fit all. This isn't a scarf, it's not a pair of gloves, and it's not a beanie, Minister. This is not appropriate. To the 15th of March this year, the trials have cost around $24 million for those two sites. The cost per head is well over $10,000. Deputy Speaker, I do not profess to sit on in the Treasury coffins or with those boffins that spend our money for us, but I would assume that $10,000 could have been better directed for these individuals at things that actually went to the heart and the core of addressing some of the issues they find themselves in. We have no idea what this minister intends to charge taxpayers to roll out the cashless debit card in Bundaberg and Hervey Bay, and I don't know how the minister expects us to debate this legislation without this crucial information. This is symptomatic of a government's problematic approach to the way they run this country, which we saw this morning. Turnbull's mob doesn't want this parliament to be informed before making decisions, let alone the average Australian. And we saw that on trial this morning here, Deputy Speaker. The government needs to be honest with this parliament and tell us how much the trial at Bundaberg and Hervey Bay and the goldfields in WA will cost. The fact that they haven't already is an absolute disgrace. The government has spent around $24 million, as I said, on current trials alone, $7.9 million paid to Indu to manage the payment system, $1.6 million for useless and unreliable research. They have mismanaged the Australian taxpayers' money and they have damaged lives in the process. The 2016 census tells us that Australia's Indigenous population has grown by 17.4% since 2011. That's an estimated 3.3% of our total population and an estimated just slightly under 800,000 people who are concerned about the implications of a rollout of the cashless debit card. We need to be mindful of the implications of an extension of these trials and the psychological impact it has on every Indigenous person, regardless of where they live. It is imperative that we take actions of previous governments into account when we are discussing serious amendments and extensions such as the one before the House today. It is also important to note that these populations are also centred in the major cities, particularly in electorates like mine in Lindsay, Deputy Speaker. People who have suffered and been hurt by our collective actions, however well-intended they may be. People need to be reassured that our commitment to the implementation of effective education, rehabilitation and training programs are essential. They are essential to ensure that the inequality, suspicion and historical dislocation are addressed in ways that are consultative, well-resourced, well-researched and effectively delivered. While we know that most people have the ability to self-manage their incomes, we also understand that some people do need a hand. Extending the rollout of the cashless debit card without appropriate consultation and research is not an effective way of giving people a hand. It also clearly demonstrates that blatant negligence and contempt that the Turnbull government has for some of our most vulnerable Australian communities and people. Labor opposes this bill because there is insufficient, credible evidence to support the establishment of further trials. Who would have thought that if you need evidence in order to make an informed decision? In this case, the government may have been a bit confused. Proper consultation means working together with communities to ensure they get the programs they need and desire. Proper consultation means not lecturing communities you are consulting, but making a commitment to listening, discussing, acknowledge and acting on their aspirations. Systematic disadvantage cannot be solved with income management alone. This government needs to provide additional support to communities who elect to participate in those trials, and that support needs to be targeted and it needs to be based on research and evidence. It is time for this government to sit down and listen to what these vulnerable communities are saying. Thank you, Deputy Speaker.